We're on.
Namaste all, and welcome to the 250th episode of Evenings with Sraddhalu. Tonight he will cover Persia and the rise of Asia, beginning with quotes from Sri Aurobindo. Thank you.
Thank you, Narad. You began this series. Now it's been a few years, and we are at an episode of 250. That's a lot of time and a lot of themes covered. But it's been a wonderful journey, and for me personally, very educative because of the challenges of the themes that require us to go deeper into Sri Aurobindo's and the Mother's teaching. And it's amazing to see their foresight, their depth of insight, and the comprehensiveness of their vision. And it is this which we are going to explore today on this topic of Persia and the rise of Asia. And I have put 3 links in the description box, 2 of which relate to this topic directly. And then there will be others which we may cover or not, we will see. So the last 2 times that we have been speaking of the situation in Iran and then what happened subsequently, I kept referring to texts of Sri Aurobindo in the first session in particular, but the most important I had kept for the last, and we couldn't cover in the first session and we couldn't cover last time also. So this time we will begin with these. And much of what I will read from was written in 1909 in the journal that Sri Aurobindo was editing called Karma Yogin. It is through this journal that Sri Aurobindo was influencing the entire subcontinent of India to awaken to the ideal of complete freedom, to organize the entire freedom struggle and set a foundation on which the whole movement of the freedom struggle would be able to sustain on its own. Gandhi came much later, an entire decade later, and what he did was quite different in the approach. Though there were some elements he took from Sri Aurobindo's work, which are presented as Gandhian, but there are other elements which were actually Gandhian, which are quite contrary and created the confusion that followed. So I'll read first from one very simple statement Sri Aurobindo makes, and they're all brief statements as he's commenting on the world situation. So first he speaks of something very specific in the general space of Asia. And it's titled, The Spirit in Asia. A spirit moves abroad in the world today, upsetting kingdoms and raising up new principalities and powers and workings, of which are marked by swiftness and ubiquity, new in history. So something is happening that in history is new, and it's raising up new powers and upsetting long-standing kingdoms. In place, the slow developments and uncertain results of the past, we have a quickness and thoroughness which destroy in an hour and remold in a decade. So, where all of the past was slow movements, and we saw in one of the quotations in the session before last, where he says the Shah of Iran achieved in just 2 or 3 years what England took 700 years to realize. But it's also a shift, he says. It's not merely the Shah of Iran. It's not only Asia. It's a shift in the spirit, and it's the working of the divine consciousness in evolution through the force of evolution. So we have a quickness and thoroughness which destroy in an hour and remold in a decade. It is noteworthy that these rapid motions are mostly discernible in Asiatic peoples. So he's saying that the rapidity which is seen, of course, it's happening pretty much everywhere on earth, but most discernible in the Asiatic peoples. And we're going to see later why this is important. It will be perhaps the last of the quotations that I will read for today. But he describes the difference in the Asiatic space where the primary shifts are internal. And that's why it relates to the spiritual future of the world. But we go to the next text now. And this is titled The Persian Revolution. Remember, this is 1909, probably July, August. And he writes, the Persian Revolution has settled with a swiftness and decisiveness second only to the movement of Turkey, the constitutional struggle in Iran between a reactionary Shah and a rejuvenated, eager, and ardent nation. The weak and unstable promise breaker at Tehran has fallen, mourned by a sympathetic Anglo-Indian, but by no one else in the world. So there was one king. He was breaking promises. He was unstable. He has been removed. Since the late Shah, under the pressure of passive resistance, yielded a constitution to his people, the young nationalism of Persia has been attempting to force and persuade his son to keep the oaths with which he started his reign. Some deeds of blood on both sides, some sharp encounters have attended the process, but the price paid has been comparatively small. Now, before I proceed, I'll just give you a background of what actually happened. So there was this one ruler who was under severe influences, largely from Russia and England and some other areas, powers nearby. He was toppled, replaced by the then king, who abdicated in favor of his 11-year-old son. So this is the young son that Sri Aurobindo is referring to. But all this was part of a large struggle which was referred to as the Persian Constitutional Revolution. And it began in 1905, ended in 1911. So the whole point of that struggle was to bring about a constitution. And it's the first time in the Islamic world that you had a revolution of this kind. And they were aiming to bring Iran into the modern world with a modern rule and organize it as a nation while it was still fragmented among tribes. And most importantly, they discovered oil. So with oil came the exploitation under British rule, interests from on the other side from Russia, again trying to get in. Both were trying to grab the oil. And that's about the time when, with this constitutional shift, they created Iran's first oil company. So initially it was about protesting foreign rule and merchants largely who were pushing for this independence. And then they created the Majlis, which were the discussions, the representatives for discussion. And just as a background, before all this happened, there was a huge exploitation of Iran. So there were various series of treaties in which Iran suffered foreign intrusion, exploitation. Militarily, it was weak. It was not cohesive. They never stood together. They were fragmented. There was a lot of corruption. So 1813 and 1828, Iran lost Georgia, Armenia, and the Caspian Navy to Russia. They gave up claims to Afghanistan. They had to pay some 3 million pounds to the Tsar as indemnity. And they withdrew from Herat, which was at the earlier part of Iran, by signing a treaty with Britain. And Iran did not have a standing army, so they had no means of defense. They could be easily bullied. And then Shah, who was running things, he depended on the loyalty of local tribes. And so unifying them was the big challenge. And the sense of nation had not formed. So this is the backdrop of the situation in which this transition took place, where one king who was at the time a stooge of the foreign powers was overthrown. It was a revolutionary overthrow. It was bloody. And it was replaced by, so this, if I look up the name, it was Muhammad Ali Shah. And instead, Ahmad Shah came to, sorry. So it was Muhammad Ali Shah who overthrew the previous person. And then he abdicated in favor of his 11-year-old son. So this is where we are, where Sri Aurobindo is writing this. A very important statement Sri Aurobindo makes. So there's deeds of blood on both sides, but the price has been comparatively small. Like other Asiatic states, in a similar process of transformation, Persia has rejected the theoretic charms of a republic. She has set up a prince who is young enough to be trained to the habits of a constitutional monarch before he takes up the authority of kingship. So here's something interesting. Sri Aurobindo says that the republic, in theory, is a charming idea. So you have people who will elect their representatives, who will then come together and rule. And the people will choose who are their good rulers, and they will replace them if they're not good enough. So that's the republic. It's not democracy, it's a republic. So democratic republic. India, for example, is a democratic republic. United States is a democratic republic. You elect people who then run or don't run according to your wishes. You don't like them, you throw them away after 5 years, but meanwhile, they've done the damage. The next lot give you promises, they come to power, they again don't do what they have promised you, and so on. That's the problem of the republic. So, in theory, it's nice, but in practice, it does not quite work. But you notice something interesting. He says, other Asiatic states also, in a similar process of transformation, have rejected these theoretical charms of the republic. And she has set up instead a prince who's young enough to be trained to be a constitutional monarch. So he'll be a monarch, but he won't be a whimsical monarch. He has to follow the constitution. So there are certain checks and balances. And before he comes into kingship, he has time to be trained. So Sri Aurobindo is seeing this as a positive move. Why is that? So you'll see here in India also, the temperament of the people is not so much suited, is not so much aligned to the republic concept. The thinking of the people is to trust somebody in whom they see the wisdom or the strength or the administrative capability, in whom they can put faith, and elect that person as a king. So Sri Aurobindo comments on this. He says that the parliamentary system does not work. Even in Europe, it has brought Europe to its sorry pass, is the actual quote. Only it has worked in England, which is a very small nation. And he quotes from Napoleon, saying it's a nation of shopkeepers. It's only worked there. It's not worked anywhere else. Everywhere else, it has destroyed things. So in India also, he says, the mentality of the people is to elect their king. So when you vote, you don't vote for your local representative who gets to power. And then all the local representatives get to power, and supposedly they sit together and sort out rationally and do what is best for the nation. That's the concept of the parliament. Doesn't work. People want to elect their king. So when you vote, 1984, the political corruption was so horrible. People voted for Rajiv Gandhi. He was son of Indira Gandhi, he was well known, but he was totally fresh, new. People wanted a fresh face, uncorrupted. And when he came, it was with huge promises. And he himself says in his first interview after he got elected with the overwhelming majority, he said, people's expectations are scary. I think he used the word, some word equivalent. And he recognized that the expectations were high. In a few years, very quickly, he was sucked into the whole machinery. He was not competent, he was not skilled, he did not understand how power works, and got sucked in and was easily used by whatever interests of the parties were around, and even other compelling interests. One of the story is that the then head of one of the biggest companies in India, the people rely on, I will not avoid the name, you see the word. So the head of that supposedly went to Rajiv Gandhi and said, so Rajiv said, I'm not corruptible, I won't take bribe. So the man said, don't worry, I'm not here to give bribe. I owed your mother 300 crores. Should I give it back to you or to the party? And that's how Rajiv was pulled into that influence. That's the story. I'm not commenting on whether it's true. But that's the kind of game which he was incompetent to recognize. The same thing you see overwhelmingly when Modi came to power, both in Gujarat and in India. It was overwhelmingly because you chose Modi, not BJP, because you trusted the man. It's a different question whether the person is worthy of trust or whether he's competent or not. The people want to choose their king. So the slogan is not vote for BJP. The slogan was vote for Modi. The slogan was not vote for Congress. It was vote for Rajiv Gandhi. That's how people think. So you have to understand a system has to align to the thinking of the people. And if it does not align, then there's a major mismatch and that creates a whole lot of other problems. So what you see in the Middle East, in many of the Asiatic countries, is this temperament of choosing their king, trusting their king, who is incorruptible, who holds high values, who holds high standards, and ensures that the machinery, which is then constitutionally controlled or democratically elected, is properly managed. So for India, particularly, Sri Aurobindo had said parliamentary democracy is a mistake. It should have been a presidential model similar to the United States. Better still was the French modification, where you elect the president and the president then appoints the prime minister and the cabinet who manage things. And president stands as a watchman to ensure they don't mess up things. That's a model better suited for India. Now you'll see in practice how profound Sri Aurobindo's observation is. In Japan, for example, even though today there's a parliament, etc., and I'm saying etc. because the reality is that it is the emperor who's ruling. Although after the Second World War, the Allied powers ensured that the emperor was overthrown, no more is he treated as an emperor officially in the constitution and so on. The reality is the people still look up to the emperor. And when the emperor travels anywhere, the entire traffic pauses, sets aside. There's a deep, profound respect for this person, the Mikado, as he's called. And we'll find Sri Aurobindo referring to that later. You find similarly in Nepal, in Thailand, similarly, you have the kings. In Nepal, the king, at some point, the entire royal family was eliminated by one person. He went with a machine gun and shot everybody else, became then the only surviving king, and then made a transition to a parliamentary system with the king overseeing the parliament. You see the same pattern in what's the little country on the northeast of India, between China and India. Anyway, you see there also again the king, but the same idea. The king is looking at the good of the people, and even if there's a democratic structure, he ensures the protection and the proper use of the structure. So this is something very interesting Sri Aurobindo is commenting on, that the theoretic charms of a republic are set aside, and you're looking at a constitutional monarch as a structure. And then he comments on what this really means. In this, we see the political wisdom, self-restraint, and instinct for the right thing to be done, which is natural to ancient nations, who, though they have grown young again, are not raw and violent peoples, new to political thought and experiment. Now, you can't say this of all countries. You can't say this of all of the Middle East, but you can say this of Persia. So an ancient nation, although becoming young again now, they're not raw and violent peoples new to political thought and experiment. They have had political developments. They have experimented in the past. There is a certain development possible, a self-restraint, a political wisdom, and an instinct for the right thing to be done, which is natural to ancient nations. So you see this happening in the Iran of that time, Persia. We see the same tendency in India, which was then unfortunately subverted by the influences that Nehru and Gandhi brought. But this would have been the broad direction it would have gone to, and many other nations that I have mentioned. Interestingly, in China, you see the same pattern. It is always the emperor to which the Chinese people look up to. And in practice, what happened was when the Communist Party took over, it was still the head of the party who was the equivalent of the emperor, whether it was Mao or others. They were the head. You never looked at who is in the party. You never look at the party itself. It's this man who stands for ensuring that the party will do good, that the party will do right. Even now, you see Xi Jinping effectively makes himself the emperor without using that name. He is now the permanent, lifelong party head, and he ensures that the party follows and does what is right. And people accept that because he's effectively the emperor, except you've removed that name. So you see this shift of mentality, which is common generally in the Asiatic states, which are going through a similar process of transformation as Persia. But there's something else about Persia. So we come to the next article. Sri Aurobindo comments. Bhutan, I was mentioning Bhutan, yes, where also you have the king. So now we come to the next article where Sri Aurobindo goes deeper into Persia's problem. Persia's difficulties, this is the title. A great and difficult task lies before the newly risen nation. No other people is so difficultly circumstanced as the Persians. Wow, that's quite a statement. Weak in herself, long a stranger to good government, military strength, and discipline, financial soundness, and internal efficiency. So she's weak, first of all, internally, because there's not that cohesion. For a long time, she has been a stranger to all these things. Why? Because of so many years of misrule. But it reminds you that before that, she has had a very ancient past where these things were part of her civilization. So, what is it that she has now been a stranger to for a long time? Good government, military strength, discipline, financial soundness, internal efficiency. Now, I'm raising all these because it shows you Sri Aurobindo's thinking as a master administrator. You have to understand Sri Aurobindo is not merely a philosopher. He's not only a great yogi. He's not a good poet. He's not just a good politician. He's also a master administrator. He has proved that in his administration of the Gujarat government when he came back from England and became the secretary of the Gujarat government, the king of Gujarat at that point, and Maharaja of Baroda. And at that point, he runs the entire state and completely rejuvenates the entire working. He builds the military, he builds the navy, he builds industry, he trains people. The whole program and structure, there are a few lectures of the Maharaja of Baroda, which he has written, which describe the overall strategy for how it should be done. But if you look at what happens under his rule, because he's effectively the man ruling, the king is only a figurehead, and the way he organizes it, you see how you can bring about a revolution in just a few years. And so I've spoken about this a little bit in one of my talks, which was given in the US in July of the year before, which is on the channel. But it's a side of Sri Aurobindo, very little known. But here's a master administrator. He's telling you what are the elements required for good government and to be an effective government, and including military strength, discipline, financial soundness, internal efficiency. So, weak in herself with all this, Persia has to evolve all these under the instant menace from north and south of two of the greatest European empires, which are these two, Russia from the north and the British Empire from the south. Both are squeezing from the two directions. The threat of Russia to act herself, if the new government does not instantly guarantee security on its borders, a threat made on the morrow of a violent coup d'etat, and before there has been time for the Regency to cope with any of the immediate difficulties surrounding it, is typical of the kind of peril which this proximity is likely to introduce. So there has just been a coup d'etat, where the man who was overthrown was actually Russian influenced. And then the father of this young king, the father who was abdicated, he goes and stays in Russia, shows what the alignments are. Okay, so there's a constant pressure. Remember, there's a young regent. His father is sitting in Russia as in exile and under Russian protection. What do you think is going to happen? What kind of pressures, psychological pressures, do you think will be? And this is a constant, instant pressure, he says. Instant meaning present at every moment. So what's required now? Self-restraint and patience towards these doubtful friends, and unbounded energy and decision within are the only qualities by which the statesmen of Persia can surmount the difficulties in their path and satisfy the claims posterity makes upon them. So it's as if the future generations are saying, hey, we need to have our real kingdom. You better live up to it. Self-restraint, patience towards these doubtful friends, and unbounded energy and decision. So why self-restraint? because you can't act. You don't have the strength, you don't have the capacity, you don't have the integrity of the country. You have to understand Sri Aurobindo's perspective here is actually looking at the decades ahead through which the rebuilding has to take place. And during that period, you have to go through all this. The internal reorganization of Persia and the swift development of military strength are the first needs. Till then, Persia must bear and forbear. Interesting. Think of the distinction between bear and forbear. Interesting. So bear what is immediately and forbear what is to come ahead. But what is required? Internal reorganization and swift development of military strength. First needs. If you don't have these two, all the rest is impossible to achieve. So with the patience you have in the circumstances given, and he describes these as the most difficult of any nation, you have to start building. So from there, if you see the events from this perspective, you'll actually understand what has been happening in the region of Persia, that is now Iran. Interestingly, just as to complete that part of the discussion, what happened after this end of this whole problem which Persia had? And I'm again looking at Wikipedia. It says that whole period of Persian constitutional revolution. And it concluded, it says, the revolution ended in December 1911 when the Shah's ministers oversaw the expulsion of the deputies of the second Majlis from the parliament with the support of 12,000 Russian troops. So Russia is playing a big game there. It's removing people from the parliament, from the second Majlis. 1921, you have the Persian coup d'etat, and so on. Again, amendment to the constitution, and so on. Pahlavi dynasty becomes the legitimate sovereign, and all that follows. Now, if you look at history the way it is taught, merely in terms of names and dates, you miss this insight that Sri Aurobindo gives you. This is the real history, and this is how history should be taught. You understand what's happening internally, how an administration, how a people live, by what values, how they organize themselves, come into their own, and the formation of the national identity. That's the struggle ongoing right now, 1909. So the next article takes this up now. Remember, he has spoken of what people need, the leaders, what they need. Well, are there such people? And so the next article is titled, The New Men in Persia. It is worthy of notice that Sipahidar and Sardar Asad and Bakhtiari leader who have effected this revolution are men who in their youth have studied in Europe. It's worthy of notice. Why? They should know the springs of European politics and thoroughly understand the way in which European powers have to be dealt with, as well as the necessities and conditions of internal reorganization. Now, one of the practical difficulties when you start reorganizing in a space which is so complex is that you have no precedent. You can't say, well, 1,000 years ago they did something, but I don't know what. I've not lived it. I've not experienced it. You must have grown up in a space, or you must have lived in a space where you see actively what internal reorganization can mean. You may not replicate that, but you'll at least have a reference as a basis from which to do it your way. In this particular context, you are also dealing with those powers. The European nations are still strong and fresh with their military strength and internal reorganization and other things which he will refer to. You have to be able to deal with them on their terms while protecting your terms and values. And so it needs people who have studied in that space, grown up in that space, and know how to deal with that. Sri Aurobindo, interestingly, is one such. Grew up in England and then comes back to India with no exposure to India first, recovers his own cultural values, but now with the knowledge of and the ways of the rulers. So, see, even the words he uses, they should know the springs of European politics and thoroughly understand the way in which European powers have to be dealt with. What does that mean? Springs of European politics. So it's not about just getting into politics and negotiating. You must understand what are the underlying civilizational motives that drive their tendencies and compulsions. This is the biggest mistake that India makes in dealing with some of the external aggressive tendencies, whether religious, political, or military, from other countries or other religions. What are their primary drives? If you're unaware of that, if you're unaware of the values by which they live, you cannot deal with them on their level. You are trying to be friends with somebody who's stronger and different from you without being able to meet them at their level of values and understanding. There's an observation Sri Aurobindo made in 1934 when he was asked, what about this Hindu-Muslim problem? And he says simply, let the Hindus get organized and the problem will take care of itself. That was the comment officially recorded. But the context to that was, he said, Islam stands for strength. And it does not respect somebody who's weak. If you're strong, you meet as strong, then there's mutual respect, it works. Similarly, when you see the attempt of Christianity to enter India, what are the driving forces behind that, and particularly behind the evangelical types or the Catholic Church? There are different motives, similar in direction, but they're differently motivated. And you have to understand what is the underlying thinking. And if you do not target it on that level within their framework, while still operating from your framework, you cannot meet them and effectively counter or bring some kind of harmony or balance of working. So I remember it was with a senior nun from one of the lineages, let's say, within the Catholic tradition. And she was making a comment, and it was in passing. She said, we are a 2,000-year-old, whatever, lineage. We know what it means to wait. There's a thinking which is very different. It's actually thinking in terms of, I will do this, after me others will do that, after them others will do that, which will lead to that result maybe 100 years or 200 years down. And what I'm doing now, I will not see its results, but I'm still thinking in that target, which is 200 years away. And I know that others are thinking similarly and will follow the same. It's not as if I've started a movement and after me it dies and somebody else starts something different. There's a structured, organized purposefulness going across centuries, of which I'm a part. And I'm doing something that others are going to follow through. And nothing is going to be wasted. It's a very different kind of thinking. And if you're not able to understand that, you will not be able to negotiate or engage with that group in whatever way it is required. And if you can understand that, you can meet them on their terms, then you will know what to do to ensure that either they are aligned to national interest or they are modified to remove the elements which are contrary to national interest. This is what China is doing, interestingly, and very effectively with the Pope and with the Catholic Church. But I've gone into an aside, but this is what is to be understood by this term, springs of European politics. What are the primary driving forces, driving motives? Even the politicians may not be fully conscious of them. But in their cultural space, there are certain events which have formed them. And that creates a reaction. That creates a particular compulsion. Those you have to understand if you have to deal with them effectively. And thoroughly understand the way in which European powers have to be dealt with. And you can't do if you've not been in that space and actually engaged with that kind of work. The same thing happens when the European powers engage with the Eastern powers, when they deal with China, for example, when they deal with Iran of today. If you don't understand the mindset of the peoples, you cannot effectively negotiate. I don't remember if I mentioned this. I had intended to mention, but if I'm repeating, pardon me. I remember it was a conversation I had with somebody in the United States in the political space, and I told them, you people are approaching Iran the wrong way. You're trying to bully them, threaten them, and bash them up. It doesn't work like that. There are people with self-respect. It's an ancient culture and civilization. You have to treat them with respect. And it's interesting that Trump is actually doing that in the negotiations when he says, make Iran great again. But there was one point when certain things happened after the bombing. The Iranian head actually said, we will not accept disrespect. Interesting as a statement. It's not about negotiation. The negotiation itself has to be respectful. Otherwise, you're not standing by values that these people live by. You are a brute and a crude fellow, and they don't respect you. So you want to meet them, you have to meet them at their level of civilizational values. So these are again very subtle but key elements in success in international affairs, especially when you are spanning different traditions, civilizational, and national values. So Sri Aurobindo is pointing to this. They should know the springs of European politics and thoroughly understand the way in which European powers have to be dealt with, as well as the necessity and conditions of internal reorganization. What are the conditions in which you can reorganize Iran? Then he generalizes the whole point. He's spoken about a few men in Persia, but then he says, the problem for all Asiatic peoples is the preservation of their national individuality and existence while equipping themselves with the weapons of the modern struggle for survival. Very interesting insight. The weapons of the modern struggle for survival. What does that mean? What are these weapons? And you understand that when you look at how things have shaped over the last 100 years, particularly during the colonial phase, how the colonization took place and how the colonizations were overthrown. And this is where the modern struggle for survival and the weapons for the modern struggle of survival are defined. That is now shifting. If you apply this, the principle, you see, Sri Aurobindo talks at the level of principles. So weapons of the modern struggle for survival. Fast forward 100 years, what are the weapons for modern struggle for survival? These include technologies, AI, network, and etc. These are also weapons for survival. Without that, you're nowhere. But while equipping themselves with the weapons for modern struggle for survival, which at that point would have included, among other things, also guns and other things, but preservation of their national individuality and existence while making this shift. Otherwise, as you shift into this mode of the weapons for modern struggle for survival, if you throw away that, you are not the same. You have been totally wiped out. This you see in large parts of North Africa. Under colonial rule, they lost whatever they had of identity. Some of them still survive, but with a modification to the identity, which is also quite peculiar. So you see Morocco, because it was a hub for high culture, under French rule, which Frenchified Morocco to a great extent, you still have something of that identity of the Moroccan people. You go further south from there, you don't have the same. There, the identity has been wiped out. They have been completely Francocized. I don't know what the term would be. It's interesting to observe these things. How do you preserve the national individuality and the national existence while making this major shift? And this is a problem for all Asiatic peoples. So what's required here? A deep study of European politics, a strong feeling for Asiatic institutions and ideals, a selfless patriotism and immense faith, courage, and self-restraint are the qualities essential to their leaders in these critical times. Think about what that means. So first, let's look at the same situation as it was then, 1909, but also look at the situation today. So a deep study of European politics, you must understand what happens there and how it was, because you have to deal with that. A strong feeling for Asiatic institutions and ideals. If you don't have that, well, you don't have what it takes to protect your own nation. This was Nehru's great failure. Nehru was not Indian. He did not have anything of the Indian values. He was British. And he was proud to declare that he was British. So I've mentioned this before. When he became prime minister, he told the American ambassador, Kenneth Galbraith, that he's the last Englishman to rule India. That was the mentality. So he failed because of this. He did not understand the Indian institutions and ideals. He didn't have a feeling for them. He didn't experience them. And he was proud of that identity. And he also lacked a deep study of European politics. He did not understand that he was making all the classic errors in dealing with the European powers and allowing, therefore, India to be swept away by his foolishness. Immense faith, courage, and self-restraint. These two are necessary for the leaders. And particularly self-restraint because you are starting at a position where you're on the back foot. dealing with powers better organized and stronger than you. So you have to have courage, self-restraint, and faith. Because the faith is that what you're doing now, you will see the consequences 100 years from now. And you must know that you're doing the right thing when you're doing the right thing. So essential, these qualities are essential to leaders in these critical times. Well, I'm going to fast forward this 100 years and you reread this in terms of today. What is needed for all these emerging spaces, Asia generally? I'm going to look at India first. A deep study of, now you have to broaden European politics to include the American politics because it's an extension, but with a major shift. Understand that mindset. Understand what is their driving force. It's still the most powerful force militarily and economically in the world today. Understand China from an Indian perspective. And again, there are civilizational differences, common features and differences. And then you must have your own institutions and ideals, and then selfless patriotism. So patriotism is good, but it has to be selfless if you're going to be an effective leader. What that means again, if you really have to introspect each of these terms and see where that leads. So patriotism is good, and you will see how patriotism easily can be swept into national ego. When it is selfless, then you know, and with combination of the patience, courage, and faith, you can act in the long term, knowing that it's not within your lifetime that the things will be done as needed. Now, after saying all this, and this is a general statement, Sri Aurobindo observes, it is reassuring to find Persians high in praise of the self-denying and lofty character of the new regent. So there are people who are actually praising this young prince, 11 years old, but still it's interesting. In the absence of a patriotic king like the Mikado, such a man alone can form the center of national reconstruction. To me, this is one of the mind-blowing insights. Such a man alone can form the center of national reconstruction. First of all, when you want to rebuild a nation, you need a focal point around which you rebuild. When you are rebuilding, what are you thinking of? For whom are you doing this? Now, even if you say, as in the Indian context, we have the ideal of Mother India. You work for Mother India. You serve Mother India. Who is she? And in the physical domain, what is her representation? Now, it could be in the form of a temple, it could be the form of a location, it could be a form of an object, it can be the form of a person. And a person who embodies that ideal or embodies your representation of that ideal towards Mother India. But you need a focal point externally. And this is essential in the collective action. Who is the focal point? Effectively the leader, even if unspoken leader. So he says, in the absence of a patriotic king like the Mikado, such a man alone can form the center of national reconstruction. If you had a king like Mikado, patriotic king like Mikado, that would be great. But when he's not there, then you need this kind of person. So we have to look at what is this patriotic king Mikado. This Mikado is the term used in Japan for their emperor. It means literally great door or great house. The house meaning the lineage of the king, of the emperor. So it's not one man. It's the whole institution of that lineage that is being spoken of when you say Mikado. Mikado is also the term, not just emperor, it is the same term used for a great deity or god. And Japan has a lot of these deities and gods. Even their origin story is of a deity, a goddess who came from somewhere, escaped, hid in a cave, and then she had to be called out, etc. She becomes the originator of the Japanese peoples. Now, so somewhere inside, the king is lifted, revered almost like a deity. And it's not just the king, he is the institution of which the human is the representative. So in the absence of a patriotic king like the Mikado, see what that means. Such a man, this new regent, self-denying with a lofty character, alone can form the center of national reconstruction. So when you're doing this rebuilding of the nation, what's the focal point around which this happens? Now, if you understand how this works, fast forward to the modern times. What is that center for national rebuilding? Around what? What's the ideal? What is the common feature? And if that is lacking, you will have fragments even in the nation building. or nation building will have contrary and conflicting impulses. This is one of the reasons why the British rule was so useful for unifying India. It's as if the whole nation combining together against to overthrow the British, that becomes the negative focal point. But what's your positive focal point? Not so clear. And to the extent that Mahatma Gandhi hijacked that role in the dramatic form that he did certain things, it also deflected that from Mother India and the higher Asiatic institutions and ideals, which are the true spring of the Indian civilization, to something which was a kind of a hodgepodge and a confusion. What would have been better would have been something more true, more deep. If you remember, one of the key elements which swung the whole independence struggle was when Bal Gangadhar Tilak started the worship of Ganesh, first in Maharashtra, then across the country. This celebration of Ganesh and the reviving of this divinity and the worship of divinity as a focal point within the freedom struggle unified the country and brought it together and welded the whole movement into a whole. That's when Gandhi came in and took it off track. And at that point, he said, first we demand not freedom, but he made the requirement was that the Muslims should have the right to have the Caliph of Turkey as their head. And he just broke the whole thing. At that point, the seeds of division were sown, Sri Aurobindo's statement. That's when the Muslims became a separate identity within the freedom struggle, which led to the partition. And even that would have been avoided, as we will see in another quotation. But this was the point where unification took place around a deeper spiritual symbol and ideal, but a living force. So this is titled The New Men in Persia. Short articles, but so deep, so profound in insights they give you. So we go now to one more. He's making a comment in passing about how the British are quaking because of the struggle which is already happening. People are waking up. I am not going to read the whole thing, but the ending of this, he is describing how one of the leaders has risen. Bipin Chandra is now a peaceful, unsuspecting journalist and lecturer, and we hope he will shake the British Kailash. So that is the... And then he says, what is it, one wonders, that has turned the firm and phlegmatic Briton into a nervous, quaking old woman in love with imaginary terrors? Is it democracy? Is it the new sensational press run by Hamsworth and company? The phenomenon is inexplicable, but it is to be feared. It is going to be permanent. So he's seeing this trend in England and he says this is going to become permanent, and we can see how it has. So I'm going to skip that, but the most important article of this series, actually two. This one goes deep into the nature of underlying forces and particularly karmic forces on a collective level. So it's titled The Recoil of Karma. And I read, there is a general law that karma rebounds upon the doer. It's a general statement. Associated in Hindu philosophy, mainly with the individual and the theory of rebirth, this truth has also been recognized as equally applicable on other lines to the present life and to the destiny of nations. So normally you think of karma as something in the context of rebirth. You did well before, you get good benefit, you had problems before, you had negative results. But he says it is equally applicable to the present life and to the destiny of nations. And it is to this that he will come. And this is fascinating. The karma of the British people in India has been of a mixed quality. So far as it has opened the gates of Western knowledge to the people of this country, it has been good. And in return, the thought and knowledge of India has poured back upon Europe to return the gift with over measure. Fascinating. So, first part of this British karma in India, there's been a mixed quality. So, first part is positive, then we'll see the other negative side. So, initially, it was the gates of Western knowledge that were open to the people in India. And then, in measure, India poured back upon Europe to return the gift with over measure, meaning much more. If you look back at some of the major scientific developments, including quantum physics, all the quantum physics, let's say, discoverers or scientists, Heisenberg and others, were students of the Upanishads, for example. German philosophy itself drew heavily on the Upanishads, partly from the Veda, and also extensively from the Bhagavad Gita. Certain terms in philosophy were drawn directly from the Upanishads, including terms such as being and non-being, etc. And Rajiv Malhotra has done a great job describing some of these things. But you see here, on one side, the British give something. On the other side, there is a return, but to Europe, not just the British. The gift with overmeasure. Now comes the lack, where things went wrong. Had they, in addition, consciously raised up and educated the whole people, all the fruits of that good karma would have gone to England. Okay, you get the idea. If they had actually taken trouble now to extend this, and it was, India had already been battered under various things, and you help people to wake up at that point, the good would have gone to England. They didn't do that. What happens then? But the education they have given is bad, meager, and restricted to the few. And their sympathy for the people has been formal and deficient. It's there in form, but not real. And the education is bad, meager, and restricted to the few. It is largely the colonial education, Macaulayan education, etc. So what happens because they did not do that? In consequence, the main flood of the new thought and knowledge has been diverted to America. Fascinating. This is so amazing as an insight. In consequence, because the British neglected this part, the flood of the new thought, the main flood of the new thought and knowledge has been diverted to America. The giant of the future. He calls America the giant of the future in 1909. Nobody could have foreseen this. America was just a set of colonies that had broken away from the British Empire and formed their own democratic republic. Even as a force in global affairs, it was nowhere. It was nowhere because bounded by two oceans, not directly connected to Europe or to Asia. It was not a global player at that point. It was just a land of freedom and dreams. You could go there, pretty much do what you liked. You were free to, by the way, at that point, even there was no income tax, 1909. All that came around that time or just after, when the cabal began to take a grip and control the finances in the United States. But at that point, it was just the freedom. You could go there, do what you liked, and build your own future as you wanted. Sri Aurobindo is seeing this already. All the fruits of that good karma from India. The main flood of the new thought and knowledge has been diverted to America. It's as if it should have gone towards England, but gets diverted to America. And remember, England and America have just separated. That force has now gone there. Diverted to America, the giant of the future, which alone of the nations has shown an active and practical sympathy and understanding of our nation. Of all the nations, America alone has shown an active and practical sympathy and understanding of our nation. Why? One of the elements was they had just broken away from the British and they saw India, another huge subcontinent, struggling to break free. So there's this active sympathy and understanding, but also at a deeper level, there's an appreciation for the values of what India stands for. You must also understand at that point, a lot of the best of Europe had moved to America. And so these people were already exposed to values from India and were looking at it. Some of the greatest scientists of that period, including Nikola Tesla, Hilbert, and Kelvin, Lord Kelvin, although he was in England, all of them were students of Swami Vivekananda, and generally of the Indian philosophy and Vedanta. Tesla quotes extensively from the Vedic knowledge and the Vedantic teaching. They are discussing concepts which come from the Veda of the 5 elements and the ether and so on. This is something I've spoken of elsewhere. Just to give one example of in the domain of science, the kind of connection and respect you have at that point. Also, a little later perhaps, that you have one of the very famous writers from the United States who visits India and comes back with this extraordinary statement that India is the mother of all the values of the West. He was a good friend of Tesla. I forget his name if somebody types it in the chat box, but very famous writer. We'll come back. So you have a very different relationship between America and India. And of all the nations, this is the only one, Sri Aurobindo says. So I reread that part. In consequence, the main flood of the new thought and knowledge has been diverted to America, the giant of the future, which alone of the nations has shown an active and practical sympathy and understanding of our nation. This amazing statement. And all this is attributing to karmic alignments, energetic flows. It continues. British karma in India has been bad insofar as it has destroyed our industries and arrested our national development. If you go back 100 years from that point when Sri Aurobindo was writing this, all you see is destruction of industries so that the British industry could replace the Indian, and the Indian became the buyer for the British products and a raw material supplier. So if you recall, I've spoken in another talk about this. India was producing something like 25% of global industrial output when the British came into trade. From the point they began to take over, they began to crush industry after industry, shut them down, destroyed them deliberately, until India became something like 1% of global industrial output when British left. So this is the bad karma. Mark Twain, yes. Thank you, Revati Marks. It is Mark Twain who visited India, and he was here for 9 months, traveling all over India. Strangely enough, you will find there's no mention of this even in his Wikipedia history. And I don't know why they had to edit it, because he's in such high praise. He says Sanskrit is the mother of all the European languages. India is the mother for so many things. And the praise that he gives and the description of his travels in India, these he shared with Nikola Tesla, among other things, by the way. But this gives you an insight into the way the American people, writers, and the elite related to India in that period. But we continue. This karma, the bad karma of the British, this karma is also beginning to recoil, patently in boycott and unrest, much more subtly in the growing demoralization of British politics. Now, this is really subtle. First, patently, you have boycott and unrest. So the British industries are suffering and they cannot control India easily. That's obvious. But more subtly, the growing demoralization of British politics. If you are suppressing a people, your own people begin to have psychological effects from that. And there is demoralization there. Already the jealous love of liberty is beginning to wane in the upper classes in England. Look at the trend. He's seeing the shift in the upper classes, and then that goes down into the lower. Political thinkers are emerging who announce the failure of democracy. The doctrine of the rule of the strong man is gaining ground, and the temptation to strengthen the executive at the expense of the liberty of the citizen is proving too powerful even for a radical government. So it's as if at the higher levels of British society, there is the thinking that democracy has failed and you need to have a strong man who will run things strongly. And even the king is not strong enough for that. Why is this happening? It's part of the karma of suppression of India now coming back to the British. Now, this is really subtle, although once you go into the inner quality of the way energy flows, you recognize how it works. You are dominating others with an iron fist. There's a point where you become of the values of the iron fist with yourself and with your own people. If you don't exercise on others the values that you live for yourself, you can't continue long enough. Either you will start living those values which you exercise on others, or you'll have to come back to your values and live on with others the way you live for yourself. That's the problem here, and that's the karmic link. And he's going to elaborate on this. It seems impossible that even a veiled despotism or a virtual oligarchy should ever again rule in England. Yet stranger things have happened in history. So 1909, you say it's impossible that England will be taken over by some kind of despotism or a virtual oligarchy. So there's an oligarchy, but you don't see who they are actually. These are powerful men, controllers, industries, people behind the scenes. They combine together, they control. The prime minister in front is a puppet. These are the rulers. We have spoken of this as the deep state and the cabal. But he says stranger things have happened, and he's foreseeing this trend. It's not only happened in England, it's happened in large parts all over Europe. It happened in the United States. And at that point, nobody could have foreseen it. Sri Aurobindo saying, well, stranger things have happened. But it's still, he's linking it to the karmic trend. The change may come by the force, the change may come by the growth of socialism and the seizure of the doctrine of state despotism by masterful and ambitious minds to cloak a usurpation, the ancient and known forms of which would not be tolerated. So he's telling you how it's going to happen, how this takeover will take place. First, by the growth of socialism. And you see how this has happened all over Europe and the Americas. It's happening around India. Everywhere where you see these socialist political leaders coming into power and then declaring their social objectives, and some of them dangerously. Recently, as you know, what's happening currently in the United States, the mayor of New York from the Democrat Party is hardcore socialist to the extent that he says, I will make everything free. Of course, the rich people will have to pay and we will tax them heavily. The same game they have done everywhere. Once they come into power, they destroy the economy completely by this. But in the ideal that they place, oh, we will give free access to whatever benefits to the poor and we care for the poor and so on. That's the entry point. And after that, the whole thing is flipped. They become then the elite who run the machinery and keep others weak and subjugated. So that's one form, the growth of socialism. You see the same thing is happening now in around India in many other countries, including Sri Lanka. And the seizure of the doctrine of state despotism. So the state has to become now the all-powerful. The state will do good for you. The state will ensure that you're given freebies. You're given all the food and the transport and the education for free. Of course, someone will have to pay, but it'll be you indirectly. But the state despotism, but by masterful and ambitious minds who will cloak a usurpation, the ancient and known forms of which would not be tolerated. If you did it the old way, they would not accept. You do it in a new way, cloaked. I'll give another good example of how it's happened in Europe, and so skillfully with the European Union, which of course was a necessary step economically. They've made a political union where now there is a European Parliament which is unelected by the people, and the head of the parliament unelected by the people. There's some lady, Ursula something, and she now dictates terms to other countries which are part of the European Union. And who is she responsible to? Nobody. And it's been done very cleverly, keeping intact the underlying democratic structures, apparently, at least in form. And above that, this overriding parliament structure in which the cabal puts its puppets and they do what they like. It's fascinating how cleverly it's been done, and people do not see. And it's been done in small steps over a few decades. People do not notice. Each time they get used to it, the next step is taken and the next. So, seizure of the doctrine of state despotism and growth of socialism. These are the two methods by which this will come over. And he's telling you what's going to happen in the future. And he gives the example, just as the Caesars while avoiding the detested name and form of kingship, yet ruled Rome under the harmless titles of princeps and imperators, first man of the state and general, far more despotically than Tarquin could have done. So the last king of Rome was Tarquin, despot. He even killed some of the senators to ensure that he ruled and he controlled things. And that's considered to be bad. So what happens, the next lot that comes in and declares themselves, hey, we have overthrown the king. We are not kings. What are we then? So it is the princeps is the first citizen. Of all the citizens, this now ruler is the first citizen. All right, he's still a citizen. But effectively, they have ruled more despotically than the previous kings, or they call themselves imperator or general. The same thing happens. They are effectively the kings. The example you see in China, as well as many other states, including in Europe, it's practically that. And to me, it's quite shocking to see when you visit some of those countries, it seems as if everybody you meet hates this person, whoever is ruling. And you ask, how does the person get elected? When you vote, how do you vote? Oh, yeah, but we didn't have a choice. The other person was so much worse, or there was nobody else, or some such excuse is given, or the person we liked would never have won, so we voted for somebody we knew would win. I don't understand this. But the game has been very subtly and cleverly played by manipulation, and eventually you keep having this person, and he knows he can't be overthrown. You see this around the world. It's interesting. It's almost as if everywhere today, the thinking is, get done with this election system. Let's have one good person who will rule and who will do what's right. That's the kind of thinking which is being, so to say, programmed in the collective. So Sri Aurobindo continues, under whatever disguises the change may steal upon the people. So it'll have to creep in and take over by theft. One thing is certain, that if Lord Morley and the Anglo-Indian proconsuls succeed in perpetuating absolutism in India, it will recoil from India to reconquer England. This is the karmic thing. If they impose absolutism on India, they will come under absolute rule. If they can give India freedom, they will regain their freedom. Very interesting, the dynamics underlying. And this is not always obvious on the surface. It's a karmic flow, but if you start analyzing, you'll see, yes, that's how it works. You'll see the working of it. But the underlying is the energy and the karmic energy which will compel it. And so he completes this article by saying, the nationalists of this country, India, are fighting not only for the liberties of India, but for the liberties of England. What an amazing insight. So when India is fighting for freedom from colonial rule, she is also fighting for freedom of the English people because of this karmic connection. What an insight. It's fascinating. And if you now extend this to what's happening in the world circumstances today, you get some very interesting understanding. And we come now to the last article. And this is also overwhelmingly important and relevant today. And this article is titled, Liberty or Empire? So we're seeing now we have moved already. We understood the circumstances in Persia, Iran of today. We're looking at the circumstances of India then and now, and then generalizing to certain insights. Liberty or empire? Again, it's like a choice. Sri Aurobindo writes, it is an ancient and perpetually recurring choice which is now being offered to the British people. The choice between liberty and empire. So throughout history, this is a recurring choice. And this choice is now coming before the British. And the choice is between liberty and empire. It's happened to others. Others have been given this choice also. Now it's the turn of the British people. They have to make the choice. And then he'll give examples of how it has happened in the past. The two are incompatible, liberty and empire. The two are incompatible except by the substitution of a free federation for a dominion. Think of what that means. If you make a free federation instead of a dominion, then perhaps the two can exist. And this you will see is what Sri Aurobindo repeatedly tells us is the means for the future, even for all countries and even for India. The free federation for the global unification also, it's free federation or dominion. Only then you can have liberty and empire together. Then it's not empire in the conventional sense. Otherwise, the two are incompatible. Now he gives examples. Rome was offered the choice. She won an empire and lost her liberty. So Rome made the choice of empire, lost liberty. External expansion has always been accompanied by concentration of internal power in king or oligarchy. Interesting. Always. Sri Aurobindo rarely uses this. Always means there's no exception here. Whenever you expand outside your borders, there's a concentration of internal power in king, or if it's not one king, it is oligarchy. You see China again, a similar thing. In the struggle to, so to say, conquer resources in the world or dominate the world, global market, economically, even political influence, whatever it is, there's an expansionism of whatever form it takes. And as a result, there's a concentration of internal power in king or oligarchy. You saw the same during British rule. In the British Empire, you saw the same subsequently with the American Empire. When America was expanding, it was the same pattern. I remember once, some time back, and it was pre-Trump in a visit to America. It was on some occasion, some program, and they had a patriotic, the national anthem with a video, a patriotic video. And the video was of American troops conquering land. So you had the commandos going like this and shooting, tanks, planes, military. And the whole theme of, while the anthem was playing, was this expansion and military expansion of conquest. Who are they conquering? Their land doesn't need anything. They don't even need to survive outside their boundary. They're well protected. At least you could say in parts of Europe, some country says, hey, that one is eating up my resources. I need to conquer it. America didn't have any of that, the United States. At best, it had towards Mexico a little bit, but largely it had already taken whatever it needed for its independence. Why is it that at this time, in modern times still, this must be 15 or 20 years ago, you're still showing these videos as symbol of the national anthem? And it makes you wonder, because it's so deep-rooted in that, what is the term used was American exceptionalism. That they're as if a special country, and this was after the collapse of the USSR, they became the global policemen to ensure everybody else behaved themselves according to their need. Now, this was the mentality. Under Trump, it has shifted completely. Trump has completely reversed that. He has stopped all the wars. He has withdrawn the troops. And he's very clearly following an agenda of ending this. But until then, you had this. And this was the cabal interest behind working through this. But during that time, you see the mentality of the people, you unite against this larger external expansion. So I'm continuing the text, but just to elaborate on Sri Aurobindo's comment, because some of these are very deep observations. So external expansion has always been accompanied by a concentration of internal power in king or oligarchy. Athens, the only people who attempted to be imperial and despotic abroad and democratic at home, broke down in the attempt. It's amazing, amazing insight. So liberty or empire. So when Athens started conquering, they attempted something quite extraordinary. Externally, you conquer people by being despotic and imperial, dominate. Internally, you maintain your democracy. With your own people, you're very nice. You're trying to unify liberty and empire. What happens? They broke down. Athens broke down in the attempt. You cannot force these two together. In English history also, we find that the great expansion in the 18th century led to the reactionary rule of the third George. And it was not till England, after the severe lesson in America, adopted her present colonial system, that expansion and democracy went hand in hand. So what happened was, during the British Empire and the expansion, the same thing happened. You had a dominating despotic king. This is now reactionary rule of King George III. It's under him, this despotic rule, while they're growing the British Empire, what happens? There's the shock, the severe lesson in America. They were dominating the American people, British colonies in America. They were largely European still. There was a fight between the British controlled and the French controlled territories. The British had lost a lot of wealth because of the ongoing struggles. And so they began to tax heavily. And the American people, under British rule then, said simply that you can tax us if we have a representation within your parliament so that we are involved in the decision. But you can't be imposing, otherwise you're a despot. So I will quote from one of these. What's this? So during the Declaration of Independence in America, I'm quoting from one of these articles, George III became a figure of hatred for the American independence movement. In New York City, a gold statue of the king was torn down by angry Americans. In the Declaration of Independence, George is described as a prince whose character is thus marked by every act which may define a tyrant, is unfit to be the ruler of a free people, etc. So they call him George III, the king who lost America and lost his mind. Later, apparently, he had some mental issues. But despot, tyrant. Why? Because of this expansion and its consequences, King George III. And after the severe lesson in America, England adopted her present colonial system. That expansion and democracy went hand in hand. So here's something. After that, they learned a lesson. They began to reduce the intensity of the oppression. They attempted to bring some kind of democratic structure while expanding. So now we are coming to a situation which he is describing in India and generally in the British Empire. That system was not an imperial system, but a loose collection of free states nominally united by the British Crown. So even after the colonization ended, these same ex-colonies, former colonies, came together under what was called then the it was all the colonies under British rule. They formed a group. It was a bloc that formed, I forget the name, sorry. But they continued for a long time, and under Nehru and these things continued. Eventually, the whole thing was found to be so meaningless, it dissolved. Commonwealth, yes, it was called the Commonwealth, British Commonwealth. And so it's as if a remnant, hey, we were colonized by the same British, hey, let's stay together as friends. It was pointless. But because under that, there were already entanglements of economy and otherwise, so something sustained until it meant nothing today. But you see the mentality there. Loose connection of free states nominally united by the British Crown. As long as they brought it to that level, the British Empire could stay. Now comes India, which is distinct under the British Empire, that it does not have that same level of freedom. The Indian problem is the test of British liberalism. The colonial system as it stands cannot obtain between two states which are not mother and daughter. Now we're going again into deep insight. The one would not tolerate it, the other would not be content with it. Interesting. So the Indian people would not tolerate being subjugated to this degree, and England would not be content with partial rule. Something is going to break at some point. But if England can bring herself to extend in a different form the principle of a collection of free states to India, she may keep her position in the world and her liberty together. Despotic empire and liberty she cannot keep. Despotic empire and liberty are contradictory. She cannot keep. She must either yield up absolutism abroad or renounce liberty at home. So if she keeps absolutism elsewhere, she will lose her liberty. It's interesting. So this is his comment on the situation then. I think all of these are 1909, but they show you his foresight, but also the insight which extends across centuries, and also his deep understanding of history. So you see, he's quoting from various kings of Rome and comparing patterns of rule and the trend lines by which one modified or replaced the other or kept a pretense of certain forms. When he says that you really need to understand the roots of European history and the springs of European history and really know how they work, he has done that. That's why he knows how to counter them. And that's why he was so effective in awakening the Indian people to the ideal of complete independence just through articles and ground level organization of the boycott. The result was that he was declared by the then Viceroy of India as the most dangerous man in India today, officially written in a letter to the British king. So Sri Aurobindo was the most dangerous man because he wrote. But see how he wrote, because he had insight and he knew exactly the point on which to squeeze the other, but also to awaken your own people because of this understanding. That's the kind of people he says Persia needs, or other nations need, Asiatic nations particularly, as they rise. Now, we'll still come to the bigger picture of Asia shortly. There's another article which is 1910. So at this point, Sri Aurobindo has come to Pondicherry. He has entered intensely the phase of the sadhana of the integral yoga. He has been given a larger mission. The freedom for India, he has set the foundations. He's been given the assurance that others will continue the work. He has to now work for the spiritual freedom of humanity and the future of humanity. So there he gives an interview to the Tamil Nationalist Weekly. And no, he has not yet come to Pondicherry. So it's just January 1910. He's about to. So at that point, he gives this interview. The full text of which I have seen, I have it somewhere, I couldn't dig it out. And it's quite remarkable because there he tells you certain things, something to the effect that since 1907, the first 5,000 years of the Kali Yuga have ended. And it's the beginning of a new phase. So elements like this, which he has described there, have been edited out in the collected works of Sri Aurobindo. For whatever reason, the editors have, I will not comment on that. But the text as it is published is this. Sri Aurobindo says, since 1907, we are living in a new era which is full of hope for India. Not only India, but the whole world will see sudden upheavals and revolutionary changes. The high will become low and the low high. The oppressed and the depressed shall be elevated. The nation and humanity will be animated by new consciousness, new thought, and new efforts will be made to reach new ends. Amidst these revolutionary changes, India will become free. Now, it's already the yogi seeing the trend lines, but it's in a very short statement, everything has been summarized. New ends made with new efforts, new thoughts, new consciousness all over humanity. We go to another text of Sri Aurobindo, which is dated later in when he's already in Pondicherry. I don't have the exact date here in the collected works. But this article is titled China, Japan, and India. So now he's fully set on the general space that is called Asia. For a long time, if you see all the old literature, Asia referred to generally the entire space, the Orient, including India, including China, including Japan. The Southeast Asian countries were still at that point dominated colonially. They were not the powers, economic powers that they are today. But these three were the civilizational focal points. And so when you said Asia, it included India, it meant India often. It's only recently, it was under George Bush, that the vocabulary was changed to promote China and to demote India. And by Asia, they meant only China. And India was called South Asia. It's like the backyard of Asia, but Asia is the main, is only China. So the US State Department used this as a vocabulary, and the Indian journals began to follow the same, which was a mistake. But we ignore that for now. We look at this and the vocabulary. Sri Aurobindo writes, it is significant of the tendencies of the 20th century that all its great and typical events should have occurred no longer as in the last few centuries in Europe, but in Asia. The Russo-Japanese War, the Chinese Revolution, the constitutional changes in Turkey and Persia, and last but most momentous, the revival, however indeterminate as yet, of the soul of India, are the really significant events of the young century. So this is post 1910, I think. The shifts have already begun. The century has just started, and he's saying these are the most significant events. Russo-Japanese War, Chinese Revolution. So let's look at Russo-Japanese War. You see the results of that still today, both for Russia and Japan. And it becomes the basis for Japan now to become a military and then later an economic power. The basis even in the Second World War, the role that Japan plays, Russia plays. Chinese Revolution, at that point, China was just raw materials and market for the British. You see what China is today, politically, militarily, economically, technologically. Global leader. Constitutional changes in Turkey and Persia. We have already spoken of Persia quite a bit, and Turkey multiple times in those texts we have seen. But you see also the role they are playing today. But last but most momentous is a revival, however indeterminate as yet, of the soul of India. Something is shifting there at the level of the soul. Form is yet indeterminate, but it's happening. And this is the most important, the most momentous for the world, are the really significant events of the young century. In Europe, except in its one Asiatic corner, there has been no event of corresponding magnitude and importance. One Asiatic corner, I'm not sure what he's referring to, but it is probably the part of Europe that touches Turkey. I'm not sure. The abortive energy of revolutionary fury in Russia, the growth of enormous strikes, the failure of the peace movement, the increase of legislation stamped with the pressure of a materialistic socialism, although they may hold in themselves germs of greater things, are so far mere indistinct material symptoms of disorganization and a disease vainly doctored with palliatives, not events of a definite movement of new birth and regeneration. So all these symptoms which are big in Europe at that point, Russian revolutionary fury, which is aborted. Enormous strikes all over Europe was the character of that period, and the whole socialist organization of unions, etc. Failure of the peace movement, increase of legislation, all these, he says, symptoms of disorganization and a disease vainly doctored with palliatives. It's a sickness which 100 years down becomes a serious cancer in national life. But they're not movements of birth and regeneration, they're movements of decline and illness. The importance of this new tendency, the shift of awakening in Asia, the importance of this new tendency lies in the fact that great events in Europe, even when they are outwardly spiritual, have usually an intellectual or social trend and significance. But great events in Asia have, even when they are outwardly intellectual, social, or political, a spiritual significance. Here is showing you two very different circumstances. In Europe, when something seems to be even externally spiritual, usually it has intellectual or a social trend and significance. It may look like spiritual, but the significance is there. The French Revolution, liberty, equality, fraternity, is a spiritual seeming ideal, but settles into a political, social structure and significance. But on the contrary, in Asia, he says, when great events have outwardly intellectual, social, or political appearance, they have a spiritual significance. So even when you see reform, social reform, political reform, economic change, externally it looks like, oh, something has changed on those levels, but underlying is a huge spiritual shift. Put it another way, if that internal change in consciousness did not take place, that external change would not be possible. The external change is a symptom of an internal shift of consciousness in Asia. In Europe, on the contrary, although the appearance of spirituality or religious or other form is held, internally the things remain exactly the same. And there are only external changes socially. With this two contradiction, even opposite forms, he comments. Therefore, the therefore is important. Therefore, when Asia once more becomes the theater of the world's chief events, it is a sure sign that some great spiritual revolution, perhaps a great age of spirituality, is preparing for humanity. Very interesting observation when he says, therefore, when Asia once more becomes the theater of the world's chief events. Once more, meaning in the past it was so. You don't have to go too far back, even about 200 years ago. You can see, as I said, India was producing 25% of global industrial output. You go back further, it's nearly 30% of global industrial output. But at the same time, China is producing 25% of global industrial output. So about 200 years ago, 50% of global industrial output is just held between China and India. A single state in Gujarat is producing more and higher quality of textiles than the biggest companies in Europe put together. The imbalance is stark. And the farther back you go, the more that difference is seen radically. Where Europe sees over the last 2000 years an ascension of values, cultural and civilizational, what we see in Asia is a loss of those values. Meaning the peak in Asia was higher than even the peak in Europe in civilizational and cultural values. Going back a few thousand years, there's been a decline from there for whatever reason that we don't get into now. So it's quite the opposite in many, many ways. So when Asia once more becomes the theater of world's chief events, it is a sure sign that some spiritual revolution is preparing for humanity. What revolution? Perhaps a great age of spirituality is preparing. It's not happened. It's not going to happen instantly. It's preparing. And that will be seen when you see Asia once more becoming the theater for the world's chief events. And we are at that point now. It is so obvious. And I gave these examples earlier also how even with the Ukraine war, both Ukraine and Russia were reaching out to India. United States was reaching out to India. For what? For the role India will play. Both reaching out to Iran, Turkey. China is playing a major role everywhere. Japan is playing a major role everywhere. Southeast Asian countries economically, technologically, in some ways at least in Taiwan, for example. South Korea. You see leadership of various kinds. So the shift that is taking place of the theater of the world's major events centering around Asia, this is a sign of a great age of spirituality preparing for humanity. It's a long way away still, but it's preparing. And when things prepare, there are always those who are on the cutting edge of the preparation. And the question we will ask ourselves is, where do you wish to be? And if something is preparing, that means there's already a force pushing for this to happen. And the shift you see is the effect of that force among the most receptive parts of humanity, which get lifted and pushed forward. And that's where we are now. There's one more text I want to read from. Actually, there's a couple of them, but well, let me just do one in summary. There's one which is Sri Aurobindo's comment written in 1950, June. So this is entirely about 4 months before he leaves his body. And it's the comment on the Korean conflict, 1950. So in Korea, you have the North Korea and South Korea, and there's one side which is being taken over by the communist, and the other side which is the American interest, and they're colliding, so to say, in the space of Korea. Later, you had Vietnam and others which followed. Sri Aurobindo's comment. Someone is asking him about what's happening, what should be done, why should there be this battle between these two big interests, communists and on one side and the Americans on the other. I do not know why you want a line of thought to be indicated to you for your guidance in the affair of Korea. There is nothing to hesitate about there. The whole affair is plain as a pikestaff. It is the first move in the communist plan of campaign to dominate and take possession first of these northern parts and then of Southeast Asia as a preliminary to their maneuvers with regard to the rest of the continent. In passing, Tibet as a gate opening to India. So it's the communist plan, one by one, eat up all these countries, eventually enter through Tibet, surround India, and then take over India. If they succeed, there is no reason why domination of the whole world should not follow by steps until they are ready to deal with America. So America, surrounded by two oceans, is left isolated. Communism takes over everywhere. Russia, China, at that point, the giants, then spreading each in their own space, Russia into Europe, China into the South, Asia, and all eventually surrounding, and US left alone and then taken over finally. That's the big game plan, and he's explicitly stating this. That is, provided the war can be staved off with America until Stalin can choose his time. Truman seems to have, this is the American president, Truman seems to have understood the situation if we can judge from his moves in Korea. So at that point, the US took a position to block the communist expansion. That's how you have the North and South Korea. But it is to be seen whether he's strong enough and determined enough to carry the matter through. So you see, when you're squeezed, at some point you may cave in and say, okay, for peace, let's say, fine, you take that and stop, don't go further. And they'll say, yes, of course, we won't go further. And then they start the next one, as Hitler did, as you see in everywhere where communist expansion took place earlier. Is he strong enough and determined enough? The measures he has taken are likely to be incomplete and unsuccessful, since they do not include any actual military intervention except on sea and in the air. So unless you put boots on the ground, you're not going to be successful in this, because you've only supported sea and air, Korea. That's why you have North Korea. If he had put boots on the ground, there would be no North Korea, there would be only one Korea. He didn't. And Sri Aurobindo is telling you he's going to be unsuccessful there. That seems to be the situation. We have to see how it develops. See, here's the master strategist seeing through the game and knowing exactly what your strengths and weaknesses are on both sides. And imagine the insight that he has sitting in his room in Pondicherry, knowing the world situation to this depth. Then he says, one thing is certain, that if there is too much shilly-shallying, and if America gives up now her defense of Korea, she may be driven to yield position after position until it is too late. At one point or another, she will have to stand and face the necessity of drastic action, even if it leads to war. I wanted to read this for this reason, because there's so many people who are complaining about war, complaining about this bombing and destruction, or even boots on the ground. We are making a distinction between an expansionist war, which wants to just take over because, well, it suits your interest or your colonization interests or your expansionist interests, or one where you put a defensive position to protect something of greater value. where at that point in 1950, let's say, or post-Second World War, the Americans put boots on the ground or provided support in certain parts to block the expansion of communism. It was in this respect, in this way, for something where you have to protect liberties. Now, the person being protected may not be the epitome of liberty. He may not be the best person. He may not be the nicest. He may not have the best intentions. He may be a corrupt person. But still, if that place can be protected, there is a possibility of a future better person to come. If once you allow the communist takeover, there is no such possibility ever. It was the same story with the expansionism of the Nazi values. So you have to understand why this becomes necessary. And Sri Aurobindo is very clearly stating you have to put boots on the ground. It's not enough to just provide naval and air support. You will fail. At some point, US will have to take a position. Otherwise, it'll have to go on yielding until it's too late. Eventually, somewhere you have to say this much and no more, at which point it becomes a military confrontation on the ground. So you will have to stand and face the necessity of drastic action, even if it leads to war. And you have to understand the circumstances of the recent bombing of the Iranian nuclear reactor, as well as what happened between India and Pakistan in this context. Very clear, specific, targeted to specific limitations drawn. Or in earlier context, it was to limit the expansion of the communist interests. Today, the only major focal point of military or economic conquest of this kind is from China, which is very clearly entering. And they've learned the lesson. It's not by military entry that it'll happen, it's by economic interests. So they've had largely taken over Nepal, they're now squeezing on Bhutan. They entered Sri Lanka militarily, economically, partly in a mix. It's still economically a shaky ground. Sri Lanka may have woken up. We'll see if it's too late or not. Pakistan, they have entered in both ways. They're trying to enter into other spaces like Afghanistan through economic deals. But they've learned that military expansion is too painful and economic expansion and takeover is faster and more easy. They've entered large parts of Africa, taken over entire countries in Africa through such a mechanism. So still, at some point, you have to put a hard line where you say you protect the freedom or not, even if it leads to war. Stalin also seems not to be ready to face at once the risk of a world war. And if so, Truman can turn the tables on him by constantly facing him with the onus of either taking that risk or yielding position after position to America. So what Sri Aurobindo is recommending is Truman should call out Stalin's bluff. Stalin is not ready to risk another war, another world war. So Truman should turn around. At each step where Stalin is expanding, he must put a block with military troops on the ground and force Stalin to yield ground, position after position to America, or yes, risk a world war. But since Stalin is afraid of a world war, he will yield. So this is Sri Aurobindo's advice, literally, to the American president to hold that ground and even push back. And then he writes, I think that is all that I can see at present. For the moment, the situation is as grave as it can be. It means literally the whole situation is in the balance. Whether there will be a global takeover by communism or not, it's in the balance, as grave as it can be. It cannot get more grave. That's how serious it was. And Sri Aurobindo is commenting on this. So it's a fascinating observation, but it also gives you the understanding when and why ground troops also are necessary when you are fighting for a greater ideal, in this case, simply protecting the basic possibility of a freedom. So I'm asking all of you to think in these terms when you look at what's happening in global events. Very often people fall back by saying, oh, so-and-so leader is not the nicest, he is not the cleanest, he is not the incorruptible, he is not the ideal, he is not the spiritual, he is not whatever. He may fall short on so many ways. Whatever their flaws, what are the trends that they are moving towards? What are they protecting or standing for? That is what you have to see. And in these matters, I look at two particular items: intention and competence. Sometimes you have people with good intention, but no competence. It's going to fail. They'll be manipulated, they will be misused, they'll be overthrown, they'll be puppets effectively. There are people with great competence, but wrong intention. Those are the worst. So, better a weak person than a strong person with a wrong intention. But if you have a good intention and competence and that combination, I don't care too much what other interests might be mixed in, because the overall intention is in the positive direction. And many of these names, which we have been referring to in passing as some of the global disruptors, including Trump, Modi, even Elon Musk, and Putin, they may not be the wonderful people. They may not, I say you don't have to like them. As disruptors, look at the overall trend of their intention and competence within that domain. Putin has a lot of flaws. I mean, I'm sure we can list so many things. He can even be a horrible person if it comes to that. But in terms of intention to protect Russia's interests and not primarily expansionism as in the USSR, that has ended. Similarly with Trump, it's no more American exceptionalism and expansionism. That has ended with Trump. But he will protect American interests and free America from the socialistic influences. So we'll probably have another discussion about that, because what happened between Musk and Elon Musk and Trump is very interesting. Plus what Trump has achieved in those first few months. There's some interesting things to observe which mainstream media has not covered. We'll have a session around that later. But I'm coming to the point that you don't have to like him. He does not have to be the nicest person or the most perfect epitome of whatever your value system might be. Such people are difficult to find, and it's very difficult to get into positions of power with all the goodness. You need to be somewhere with a very coarse, thick hide to survive the domain of the darkness that is the politics, and to be able to navigate through that with some sense of basic idealism or positive purposefulness. That's already a huge achievement. So the same I would say also of leadership today in Iran. It does not matter who is in power, whether it is this type or that type or this religion or that religious belief. It's not important. What will be the overall direction? If the leadership of the new Iran says, all right, all the money that we put in making an atom bomb just to out of hatred for X or Y, and it's their declared intention. They've stated it. For those who may say they have not attacked anyone, they've stated deliberately they will build a nuclear weapon for this purpose. Okay, so it's an open statement. You need a leader who will say, we will direct all this to rebuilding Iran and making it great again. And what Gaddafi did in the same way and turned around and made a model of his country, and that's why he was toppled by the cabal. That's really what you need to see in every country, where they redirect all the funds to rebuilding the nation, but with competence, with good intention, with national interest, and all the qualities which we saw Sri Aurobindo describe what are needed for the Iranian leadership then, still needed now. So I want to read from one more text of the mother, where she's speaking of what will happen. And there's a very interesting phrase she uses there, the conversion of the United States. So that's interesting, and I want to read this text only for that reason. So there was a point, and this is 1971, there was the war in Bangladesh, split of Pakistan from East Pakistan and West Pakistan into Bangladesh and West Pakistan. India played a crucial role in liberating Bangladesh from Pakistan's control. And at that point, the mother had been actively guiding the leadership of the Indian Army. That's a whole story to narrate someday. But unfortunately, most of the people who have been in that are no more alive. But if we get a chance, perhaps someday it should be possible to narrate. The mother sent her force, and I know from those who were in that space, my teacher MP Pandit was the go-between. And I know for a fact from the people there, from the point they received the mother's blessings, everything went very smoothly. At the end of that, when Bangladesh was freed, the mother instructed Indira Gandhi to go ahead and free West Pakistan. That's again, it's the cabal leadership that needed to be removed and freeing the people. And you see what India did with Bangladesh. It gave back the country. It never maintained control. Same would have happened with Pakistan. But it didn't happen. And at that point, India had nearly 150,000 soldiers captured. Large territories of Pakistan were under Indian control. And Bhutto begged Indira Gandhi and said, I give you my promise that I will set everything right. And please free up all this. And Indira Gandhi, under pressure from the United States at that point, we are told, just gave it up. This was never done in war. There's always a quid pro quo. You always ensure such a thing will not happen. She gave it up. That's again immaturity. She gave it up, he was overthrown, and the military took over, and that was the end of it. Things became worse after that. So, what mother is saying is, she then looks at what is the situation to happen in Pakistan. Remember what I've said about Pakistan. Pakistan is India. It is India cut off, an arm cut off. The people are still the same values, the same culture. And there's only this artificial cut and the oppression of a certain military and cabal interest. That, if liberated, you'll have some kind of a reunion. So, about this, mother says, Satprem asks, they have stopped fighting in the West. Mother nods, which means it's not the end of the problem, Satprem says. Mother's comment, again, it won't be done. Again, it won't be for this time. Again means earlier also an opportunity had been lost. Again, it won't be for this time. It won't be done that way. I've seen how. It won't be done through a battle. The different parts of Pakistan will demand separation. There are 5 of them. And by separating, they will join India to form a sort of confederation. That's how it will be done. So she's seeing the future. Satprem, it will break up from within. Yes, I see. Mother, that's right. That's how it will be done. I saw it. I don't remember what day recently. All of a sudden, for several hours, there was a contact with the divine power and vision. It was magnificent. Things became extraordinary. Then, immediately, the next day, all the news changed. Really extraordinary. What actually took place isn't what I saw, for it was seen years ahead. But that doesn't matter. It's all right. Sujata comes in and mother hands her the handkerchief. Mother says, these are my handkerchiefs. We are always in a hurry because life on earth is short. But when you see what is in the offing, vast circular gesture, really beautiful, much better. It takes more time, but it's much better, mother says. One of the things in the offing is the conversion of America, the United States. But it will take time. The conversion of the United States. Already, most of the country is against that president. But it has to become strong enough for that particular policy to disappear. So mother is saying that the country has turned against this. At that point, it was the warmongering president, but it had to become strong enough for that shift to take place. And one of the things in the offing for the future is the conversion of America, the United States. But it will take time, the conversion of the United States. So it is my reading that this shift has now taken place, what she is foreseeing then under Trump's administration. And for the first time, you have all the corrections necessary. Trump withdrew all the funding to terror groups. He withdrew the American army from all these different spaces. He began actively to stop wars, and some of them are taking longer, but he stopped the funding and the sending of weapons for all these wars. And regarding Pakistan particularly, we had already in the first administration restricted the funds for the terror which was going on, the terror training camps and all those things. Under his policy, the internal breakup of Pakistan has got accelerated, and this should happen more and more clearly. Hopefully, it will be through less trauma, less pain, and what mother foresaw, the 5 parts internally breaking up would want to rejoin India. Obviously, it will not be a merger. It will be a joining in a structure which she calls some sort of confederation. so that they will become entities in themselves, but with an alliance where no more there will be in need of war. And they'll be like the mother and the children and the family rejoining as a family. That would be the way forward, as she describes. She says it takes time. Life on earth is short, but when you see what is in the offing, really beautiful, much better. So I would like to perhaps close with this last quotation from the mother. So somebody was talking about the situation in Israel, and this again 1967, what is happening, and the whole problem of these conflicts. And someone asks, if World War breaks out, it will destroy the major portion of humanity, and there'll be nuclear fallout, and etc., etc. Will it not affect the advent of the supramental truth and the new race upon earth? So, mother's comment, and we will end with this. All these are mental speculations. In a way, she is also saying it's not going to happen like that. And once you enter the domain of mental imaginations, there is no end to the problems and to their solutions. But all that does not bring you one step closer to the truth. The safest and most healthy attitude of the mind is like this one. And we will all take this attitude. There's a question which was asked last time by in the chat box. Chintan had asked, how can we participate as an individual from a spiritual perspective to make things better in reference to war? So I'm going to take this as the solution for us, at least. So the safest and most healthy attitude of the mind is like this, Mother says. We have been told in a positive and definitive way that the supramental creation will follow the present one. So, whatever is in preparation for the future must be the circumstances needed for the advent, whatever they are. And as we are unable to see, and as we are unable to foresee correctly what these circumstances are, it is better to keep silent about them. The point, though, she makes is this certitude, positive and definite, that the supramental creation will follow the present one. And the circumstances today are going to be used in preparation towards that. And this should be our general attitude. Necessarily, therefore, even if it means that certain wars are taking place, we cannot do anything to stop them. Well, we would want that as quickly as possible. The suffering involved can be reduced. Humanity can come back to some superior form of alignment, of cohabitation, of mutuality, where we can be helping each other as one family for our overall spiritual growth, which is the single most important thing. This should be the direction of our aspiration, at least our intention, our prayers, our hopes. But to hold this as the certitude, we have been told in a positive and definitive way that the supramental creation will follow the present one. And so whatever is in preparation for the future must be the circumstances needed for the advent, whatever they are, whatever these circumstances. This is going to be used for that. Let's take it in that spirit. Sometimes it is through pain that we wake up, and we can hope that that pain would be at least minimized. And if we can consciously try to wake up, then we can even avoid the passage of pain. But where parts of humanity refuse to change, refuse to align to the truth consciousness that is present, that is descending, that is working to realize and establish itself, where we refuse to align to it, then the pressure crushes the refusal and breaks. Where the alignment is resistant, there is pain, but eventually through pain, the change takes place without the breaking necessarily. Where we open actively and the pressure comes, we join and unite with the truth, and there is a rapid progress, and with that, all the consequences of the truth, with its growth and beauty and joy and light and harmony and love growing actively. So really a large part of this boils down to the choices we make. Remember Sri Aurobindo's observation also, the choice given at the time to liberty or empire, perpetual recurring choice, ancient and perpetually recurring choice. Well, it is something in this direction, but from a spiritual perspective. The choice for us to align to the truth or to refuse or ignore or even go against it. It's a choice. The more of us make this choice, the more we are able to help others. So coming back to Chintan's question, when you make that choice and when you start living this more and more in your life, to the extent you can, it doesn't have to be perfect, to the extent you can, you are impacting the entire circumstances of your space, but also on a subtle, occult level, humanity. To the extent that each one of us represents a particular type or a problem or embodies a problem of human nature, when we make that shift in us, in that problem being now opened up and freed to some extent, we are also helping humanity to free from that problem. If I look at the situation of conflict, let's say Israel and Palestine, and if I can recognize the tendencies within me which correspond to those tendencies, it may not be exact, but as a tendency only. Fear, hatred, dislike, narrowness, refusal to accept another viewpoint, whatever form it may be. These are all the core elements of that struggle. To the extent I'm able to make that shift within me, I'm contributing to that change also. And that's all you can do, unless you're actively on the ground there or directly influencing circumstances there. But this, on a deeper psycho-spiritual level, you can be influencing and ensuring this does not happen again, or it does not spread to happen in your space. Because there it may be in those forms, here it may be in different forms. There it may be based on certain religious differences, here it could be on economic differences or political differences or some other differences. But the underlying principles would still be the same psychological roots and tendencies. Here, hate, dislike, inability to accept another viewpoint, or whatever the alignments could be, misalignments would be. So if you look at it from a purely psycho-spiritual perspective, you can do a lot. But it starts with you and the shift internally within you. And that's why we come back to the priority of our life, which is the spiritual awakening, growth, and development. And where we make an effort, remember, you don't have to be perfect. You don't have to reach an ideal. In the fact that you make the effort is already a great progress and a step forward. Even if the result of your effort is partial, it's a great progress. Upon that, you add one more dimension. As you make the effort, ask for the help from the Divine Mother. And to the extent that you're able to open yourself simply and say, help me as you make the effort, her consciousness fills you and supports your effort and lifts it. And you'll find often that while your normal effort would have led to a certain result, now with her help, it leads to a much greater result. Not only within you, but also in your ripple effect that we have spoken of. If you combine your individual effort with the conscious opening to allow her action within you, you have the maximum result, the maximum outcome for the given effort that you're able to make. And this should be our intention, our aspiration, and the effort with which we translate that aspiration in our lives. Let's take a moment to hold this, that we may all unite in this aspiration and in this effort. Hold the conviction and the certitude of the future, that the assurance that has been given to us, that the supramental creation will follow the present creation. And there's no doubt about that. And consciously work towards this in every small step that we can.